Should be there in a second. So without any further ado, let's get started, because we're recording now. Hello, Cloudees, and welcome everyone to yet another Cloudee Lounge virtual meeting. My name is Alex, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second virtual user group meeting under the Cloudee Lounge umbrella. If you're new to our user group, please know that we call ourselves Cloudees within this community. Cloudee is obviously a made-up word, which is meant to represent a cloud enthusiast, a potentially active user too, maybe somebody who just wants to learn or even show off or just mingle among fellow cloud architects or developers or DevOps and others, whilst also having fun at the same time. Our main sponsor is Key Ticket Solutions, who covers any financial costs related to running the events that we have. Now, in the past, as some of you already know, Cloudee Lounge is not a new community because in the past, we have acted as an in-person user group meetup, specifically meeting in Oradea, as we call it, Romania. Up until recently, our meetings were delivered in person in Oradea, and most of them, though not all of them, were delivered in Romanian. Throughout the years, we have met, we have learned, we have shared knowledge using events such as the Global Azure Bootcamp, tech summits, launch events, streaming parties, career discussions, .NET local conferences, and many more. However, times have changed, and so does our small Transylvanian community, which is why we have decided to stream on a regular basis our meetings rather than rely on in-person events only. Now, this brings me to the present, and probably the future as well. Without a doubt, virtual meetings will at some point become the norm. Until then, we will run virtual meetings as a replacement of in-person events. There's a high chance that once we can resume in-person meetings in Oradea, with a lot of people meeting up and speakers, renowned speakers coming in, we'll stream them online as well, thus also welcoming more Cloudees to our community and meetings. That said, we now have the opportunity of welcoming even more renowned speakers to share their knowledge and passion with the cloud community. Actually, this reminds me, we also have a poll where we are welcoming any additional topics you'd like to see covered in Cloudee Lounge and in our virtual meetings. I'm going to share this link with you. So if you don't have a chance to actually open up the QR scanner right now, don't worry, I'm going to share this in the chat window with you in a second. And in fact, there's one more thing. We also have a YouTube channel. Yes, it's a small YouTube. We don't have a lot of videos yet, in fact, just one, but it's something we'll fix as we get more speakers present in our small community. In fact, this brings me to today's speaker. Today's speaker is Steef-Jan. Today we have Steef-Jan with us, and he's a good buddy of mine who was eager to help Cloudee Lounge with its online presence so that it improves. I've known Steef-Jan for a while now, and thanks to the Microsoft Most Valuable program and the numerous conferences we've both attended around the world, Steef-Jan, who also runs the conference by himself together with our fellow MVP Eldert Grotenberg in the Netherlands called Azure Lowlands, and they bring together themselves renowned speakers who passionately share their knowledge and experience. Now, Steef-Jan is a certified MCDBA, MCSD, MCSD.NET, MCSA, MCAD, MCTS, you call them. Anything which has to do with integration, BizTalk, BizTalk Server, and things like that is something that he is very passionate of. He also wrote numerous books over a decade, such as BizTalk Server 2010 Cookbook under the Pack Publishing umbrella. He was a technical reviewer of the BizTalk Server 2010 patterns. He wrote a bunch of different certification guides and so on and so forth. And in fact, if you actually look at his MSDN profile, you're going to see that he has an astounding over 98,000 points, if I am to be specific. I guess you could easily say that Steef-Jan is a genuine community leader and an advocate of great technology. Now, Steef-Jan is going to talk with us today about building workflow solutions in Azure and in the cloud. As always, though, I encourage you to all take advantage of Steef-Jan's presence here and his desire to hear from you too. So if you have any feedback related to any of the technology Steef-Jan is going to unwrap, for any other integration-related topic even, speak up. Feel free to use the chat window, the chat functionality, Microsoft Teams, or simply unmute yourself. And with that, Steef-Jan, take it away.
Okay. Right. So if I'm correct, you'll see my screen.
We can see your screen.
Then here we go. So like the introduction, I'm going to talk about workflow solutions with Microsoft Azure and Cloud. So I will explain that to you guys in this talk. So, well, a little addition to what Alex already mentioned, or you didn't know yet, but I work for Cloudee, sorry, as an Azure technology consultant. I'm an MVP for over 10 years, started in integration and slowly migrated into the large bucket of Microsoft Azure. although the last couple of years I've done predominantly only Azure projects. I co-organized together with Eldred Grotenboer, as in the introduction said, Azure Lowlands. That's one of the conferences we organize in person. Also part of the Azure user group in the Netherlands. So currently even organizing anything because this is predominantly in person. I write for Serverless Nodes, so that's a part of the Cloudee platform. A lot has to do around functions and logic apps, so little tidbits. And the other thing I do is I write for InfoQ as a cloud editor. So I brought my knowledge and spectrum a bit more because this platform basically relates to all kinds of cloud technology from also other cloud vendors like AWS and Google, IBM, Alibaba, and so forth, but also different programming languages, paradigms in architectures, and so forth. And the other thing I like to do is I like to exercise. So on the left-hand side, you see a picture of me running. So I do a lot of half and full marathons. Currently also not possible because of COVID. So I've picked a few other things up to just keep me exercised a little bit besides, working with technology. Okay, so what I'll do is kind of a cloud workflow story. So I'll talk a bit about business process and workflow, set the context a bit. Then I'm going to talk about predominantly what Microsoft kind of offers in their space. So free technologies with regards to workflow. I talk a bit about what's under the hood, the pricing, some customer cases and user stories, a little bit about the operational perspective, governance, position in the market of these technologies, some takeaways and calls to action. It's quite a bit. What we in general we talk about is a business process. So what's a business process? So I kind of looked that up and on Wikipedia, it's kind of a collection of related activities that form a process. So it could be a sequence leading to, let's say, order to cash processes. So you order something, eventually the order comes into a system and then all kinds of stuff will happen in the background. And then at the end of the day, you get an invoice back. That's one of the processes.
Nee, voor zover ik kan zien, is het vandaag niet stoffig.
It's Siri, sorry. So that's kind of, what a process is. And it could be multiple processes, even in your company, let's say onboarding of people, offboarding of people, when it comes to when you're a consultant, sending off the invoices, etc. These are all kinds of processes that, you could basically automate. And something you can automate is, by basically merging or sticking all these activities together in an automated fashion, and which then gives you kind of a workflow. So you basically move information or materials from one way to the other. We get basically to the technology. So this is also common within, any of the spaces, if it's Microsoft or other vendors, which is called workflow, right? So it's an execution of steps to basically automate a complete business process. And usually when it comes to technology, they offer things like connectors, flow control, stateful or statefulness, etc. And the technologies within the Microsoft space currently today are Power Automate, Azure Logic Apps, and Durable Functions. So if you go back in time, .NET had something like workflow technology available, or you had tools like K2 and such going back and forth. These kind of technology were available on-prem, but now we're talking specifically what's available in the cloud, and we're talking about these three particular technologies. So one is part of, the Microsoft Cloud, which is in the context of Power Automate, which is kind of a ways to automate your business process. More abstracted away, part of the Power Platform, which also resides Dynamics and so forth. So that's one of the offerings. And then on the Azure side, you got Logic Apps and Azure Functions. So I'll dive more into why this distinction is here. In general, you get the Power Platform, which offers this workflow type of capability or technology, which is Power Automate, but there's more into the box as well. I already mentioned the Power Platform, and within that, you also will see Power BI, Power Apps, and Power Virtual Agents. So there's more inside its platform that the Microsoft Cloud offers, but when it comes to automating processes, you've got Power Automate. So, and what it can do is basically it can scale up your automation within your organization. You can securely integrate, with other types of data, with your common data services and such. Depending on the audience, so if you're, more like a power user, which is the way Microsoft kind of positions it, then you can be pretty productive. and you can efficiently automate your work basically within that context of you being working in the space of the Microsoft Cloud. From that perspective, you could enable digital transformation in your organization. This is more like, this is something more maybe marketish hype, but this is kind of the way it's also positioned. So you can automate legacy systems, you can build solutions within your departments, you can do all kinds of some from that Microsoft Cloud perspective. You can extend Office 365 and Dynamics if you like. And then on the other end, you have your Microsoft Azure platform, where two of the other technologies resides when it comes to workflow. And one of the technology you will find is Logic Apps. So Logic App is available within the Azure platform as a platform as a service solution, or if you look at some of the analysts, it's branded as an integration platform as a service, but it enables you, because of all of its connectors, to connect to other kinds of Azure services. You can also connect to some of the stuff within the Azure or in the Microsoft Cloud. So when it comes to Dynamics, for instance, but also to Dropbox, Salesforce. So they got some third-party connectors there as well. And through what's called an on-premise data gateway, which is basically under the hood a relay service, you can also have connectivity onto on-premise systems, whether it's SAP, SQL, and for even BizTalk Server itself. So you can basically bridge the gap from on-premise integration through an on-premise data gateway, and then kind of have a gateway out to through Logic Apps to all kinds of other services. And with Logic App, you just can basically see this technology in various enterprise type of scenarios when it comes to integrating with, let's say, B2B scenarios. When it deals with ADI, you have the integration account, which you need. You can do some data manipulation. You can do some enterprise application integration because of its connectors, even when you go on-prem, so it could even be hybrid. You can use some of the cognitive services, so you can even build some kind of cognitive services because of the connectivity. And you can even do or deal with messaging or eventing type of scenarios. So there's all kind of enterprise scenarios thinkable where it all gravitates to Logic App being, in that perspective, the center of the universe. But it's all integration related. And then there's durable functions. So then you go all the way down to basically more code, and then again you can automate at scale because you basically leverage the hosting capabilities of where your Azure durable function resides. Again, it gives you some flexibility through the bindings, and it also, if you're a developer, enhance the productivity from that perspective. So if you're less used to using designers and such, but you're more proficient in code, then from that perspective could enhance your productivity. So if you look at Azure Durable Functions, basically it's an extension on top of Azure Functions. So it was there since version 2.0 of Azure Functions, and even it's also in 3.0. And it's based upon something that's called the Durable Task Framework. So this is some open source type of library that's available since 2.14. And it basically leverages a lot of Azure storage, which will become more apparent when I advance through my talk. And what you can basically do is implementation stateful workflow as code. So that's what you could do with the actual durable functions. So what I would like to do now from all these three technologies, look at a bit about, how's the development look like? What kind of integration development environment do you kind of have, and how does the DevOps story look like when you look at these technologies? So one is Power Automate. So this is something you completely do within your browser. So you log in through Power Automate directly. Depending on if you have a Microsoft Cloud subscription, whether it's E3 or going up. And basically you've got a visual designer in front of you. So because it's a workflow or an automation of several activities, it's always starts with a trigger. Even if you go back to Workflow Foundation, you always have a trigger followed by multiple actions. And in this case, you can also have some control over it with a conditional logic. So this is all done through the browsers by just doing a drag and drop. And then as soon as you build your flow, then you have the options again through the browser to check your flow and do some real-time testing. So that's all available through the browser. So you, for instance, could schedule going to a certain RSS feed or, pick that up and then eventually send out an email. So this is kind of what this little animation shows. Is a pretty easy, straightforward process with Power Automate. When it comes to lifecycle management, it's kind of that you export your solutions from your dev environment and then unpack and store them in source control. So, and then release them to production. So this is the way of getting your solution to multiple environments. So if you develop this in a development environment and you want to push this to UAT and production, then this is the way of doing that for you. So export from your dev environment, unpack, store in source control, and then take it from there using Azure DevOps and creating pipelines. With Logic App, you get something similar. So again, you've got a visual designer which you can use through a browser. But then again, the same visual designer is available through Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code if you install an extension in those IDEs. And then from there, you can start offering, again, trigger followed by action and conditional launch. So it's pretty similar to Power Automate. The fact is that Power Automate basically resides on top of Logic App. So it's built on top of Logic App, basically sharing underneath the runtime, which I'll explain a little bit later on. What you also see is that you have a little bit more control if you look on the left-hand side on the pane. So there's more toolings, there's a code behind. I'll talk about it later. It's a domain-specific language for your Logic App definition or your workflow definition. Basically, you offer in a Logic App. So then again, you can run those, you can resubmit, you can inspect, so you can dive really into the in and outputs of your trigger, but also the following actions and such. So that's the availability. So you have a little bit more control when it comes to creating your workflows in the cloud. Then again, what I said, you can offer it in Visual Studio Code or your browser. If you develop your Logic apps within a Visual Studio, you can either connect to one that you already built through a Cloud Explorer and then download basically your workflow definition, or you offer it completely in your Visual Studio. But you need Visual Studio to basically work with the ARM template that comes with the Logic app to eventually push and store that in your source control, which could be DevOps, and then again through pipelines release it to multiple environments. And then you get something like Azure Durable Functions. So again, this allows you to basically completely codify your workflow. And then you're dealing with an orchestrator and with one or multiple activities and a client. So the client basically initiates an orchestrator and then subsequently calls one or more activities. So we'll dive a little bit more into that concept in a minute. And this is solely completely done from Visual Studio. So you can run and test it and debug this completely from Visual Studio on-prem. So you'll get the runtime tools with your functions, or when you start up, the first time you start basically debugging your function, a runtime will either be installed for you or you could have already installed it. So at least we'll ask for a runtime so you can see what happens within your durable function. Lifecycle management pretty easy because you're already in Visual Studio. You can push and store that in your source control and then using the pipelines going forward to multiple environments. So with respect, it's not like from Power Automate or Logic apps that you kind of, if you do it through a browser, you have to push stuff on-prem or at least through Visual Studio to get it into DevOps. So that's a little bit the distinction here. This is more direct. And again, because it's code, it gives you more control. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, what happens under the hood. So Power Automate is basically on top of Logic App. So what I'm going to talk about is the Logic App runtime. So with Logic Apps, it's basically because you're creating, your trigger and multiple actions, you're basically building up your workflow. Under the hood, it generates kind of, adjacent format, or it's because it's based on a domain-specific language, it creates this dependency graph of actions, which subsequently can be executed through an engine. Now, the Logic App runtime basically consists of a couple of components, which you see depicted here in this slide. So you got the resource provider, which basically looks at that workflow definition. So you drag and drop, and if you look at the code behind, you'll see that JSON basically interprets it and decompositions it into, the activity that needs to be done, depending on its dependencies. Then you got a logic app runtime, which basically this is all the I/O hardware that sits resigned in a data center in Azure, depending on which region you choose. So this is completely abstracted away. You don't see this, but it's actually really there. And this is where all the compute tasks are basically being executed. Then on the other hand, because logic app depends a lot on the connectors, there's also connection manager, which interacts with the connections you created through the connectors with your systems. And there's also connector runtime, basically interprets those connectors through an open API, because they're kind of written down an OPA description, and abstracts that away, or at least reads that and uses that. So let's look at a workflow. Let's a logic app workflow definition. So let's say you created this. You connect basically to a service bus. You get that message through the peak log mechanism. It contains multiple items or lines, which subsequently will be looped through and inserted into a SQL database. And once that's all done, then the message will be completed in a service bus. So when you save this, you get a workflow definition, which resides in Azure. And once it's triggered, it will be triggered when a message enters the service bus. So then you got this trigger task. So that's the top. This trigger task, when a new message enters, basically kicks off a workflow orchestrator. That workflow orchestrator will interpret it, basically the whole workflow definition sees, hey, there's a for each, and there's multiple inserts based on the fact that I've got multiple items. So these will all be separate tasks, which can be executed in parallel or sequential, depending on the concurrency that is being set on the for each. Once all those SQL inserts are being done, then the second or the final step it basically needs to interpret is like, okay, I need to complete that message in the service bus. And then I complete the workflow in general. So this all happens in the background. And all these are, tasks. And these tasks is basically, there's no active threat management whatsoever, within that data center on the service, right? It's just, it's executed in certain tasks, all coordinated by the orchestrator. With some of the things like at least one guaranteed execution will take place. So if one of the machines where a task needs to be executed doesn't respond, then another machine will get the task and is being asked to execute that task. The other thing, depending if you have some retry policy set up within your workflow, then it would also retry those based on when there's DNS issues or throttling or some of the 500 responses. So that's all possible. But then again, you have to take in mind it's at least once execution guaranteed by the platform. So this happens in the background. So if you look at Power Automate, under the hood, far under the hood, it basically uses the same type of execution of the workflow. And then the other end, if you so these are kind of more the declarative workflow solutions. So, you have visual designers, when it comes to logic apps, you got a markup. But then again, they're cool, but if you're a developer and you're not used to doing this visually and markup language and stuff, and you don't think that the CI/CD is, you might think, it's not entirely for me. I want to move more directly. I'll build, test my code locally, and then I'll push it to DevOps, and then I'll have my pipelines ready instead of first doing an export or fiddling around with Visual Studio Force to set it all up before I can push my before I have my templates ready and push them. And then again, also unit testing could be a little bit a challenge when it comes to workflow build in logic apps or Power Automate. And then you get into functions. So I think most of you are pretty familiar with functions. So functions are basically this, little bits of code that you can run inside the cloud. So the first, of course, was AWS with Lambda. So they kind of started off this, and then it proliferated in other cloud platforms, including Azure, where it became Azure Functions. So basically, you can trigger those functions based on something that happens. Blobs being created, message ends a queue. So you can do this through these bindings. So that's all being done and abstracted away from you. So that connectivity, you execute your code, and then you can output it to one or multiple other Azure services. So that's in general Azure Functions. But then if you look at durable functions, it's an extension on top of Azure Function based on that durable task framework, which heavily relies. So it's because of storage and the messaging and the queues, and I'll make that more apparent soon. So you get your durable function runtime extensions, that extension inside Azure Functions. You get your management API. I'll show that in a demo later on. And on top of that, you have your orchestrations, activities, but also something new that's called entities. And that durable task framework, or at least can be hosted in Azure App Services, or that kind of runtime can be in Kubernetes, can even be on your desktop, using the runtime tools available. So how do you look at this? So you can chain, or at least you can have activities, functions, or chain them together with queues in between them. So you can chain your functions. So this is, was even possible before durable functions came into the picture with Functions 2.0. But if you do it that way, then your relation between your functions, whether it's Azure Functions or whatever function or code you're in, and the queues becomes a little bit unclear. So how is this? If you look at this, how's the relation between all of these functions? Because that's not really clear. You need a database at least to get this state right. So the operational context can otherwise not really be captured really well. So you need kind of a database too to become it stateful. And before that, you have to add another component. And the middle queues, if you have multiple queues when you chain a lot of functions together, are more like overhead. And the other thing, how do you coordinate, when things go wrong, right? You need kind of a Saga pendant or do rollbacks. That maybe you're familiar with that. So, with error handling, it becomes pretty complex. However, if you look at durable functions and how this looks in code, you can do it completely different. You have this orchestration concept, right? So an orchestration function, which can be triggered through what's called an orchestration client, or a durable function client, which subsequently can call or kick off one or multiple activity functions. So then chain them all together, and you can even, create some error handling around it. And through the await, you basically separate, or at least you can chain those functions really neatly together. So first function one, activity 1, then 2, and then 3. So basically what happens in the background is that, that client could trigger an orchestration. And the way it happens is that it will use the Azure storage queue tied to your function app when it comes to when you host it up in the cloud. Locally, it's the storage emulator. So that, message enter that queue and basically then triggers the orchestrator. So the orchestrator picks it up and it's like, okay, hey, I need to schedule a task for the first activity. So we'll send that message again to another storage queue under the hood. It then will unload itself from memory, so there's no execution. It won't cost anything with regards to memory or CPU consumption. And then the activity function, or the first one, will become awake and basically does its thing, right? So it will just return 42, and we'll say, okay, task completed. The orchestrator will then become, be loaded back up in memory because it's triggered to the fact that there's another message which says, hey, task is completed. Then it will know, okay, then I have to schedule the next task. It unloads itself from memory again. The other activity function becomes live, basically does the function, the activity itself, returns, task completed, here's the outcome. And then the orchestrator will pick that up again, knows it's, okay, 1's done, 2's done, and I will schedule for activity number 3. Activity number 3 will do its work, posts basically another message to the storage queue, and then it's like, okay, 1's done, 2's done, and 3's done. And basically the orchestrator itself is complete, and then it unloads itself. So this is basically under the hood what happens with durable functions, leveraging Azure storage queues and tables. Okay, So let's look a little bit at pricing and hosting. So with Power Automate, depending on the licensing, you either do per user, per flow, or seated flow. It all depends on how the licensing and the way it is structured within the organization or within your organization, depending if what kind of agreement you have. But this is kind of the pricing, and the hosting is completely abstracted away. Then you got logic apps, and basically the pricing is here. It's per action. It's either through a standard connection, a standard connector, which is most of the connectors available. So that's how the connectivity is done with all kind of systems. And you got an enterprise connector, which basically currently is only the SAP connector. So based on that, and with the Azure calculator, you can find out, based on your workloads, what the pricing would be. The other thing, though, with hosting, it's either pay as you go, or you can completely have it isolated in what's called an integration service environment. The price will go up, but then you have a completely set of a dedicated hardware all for yourself. So you don't have noisy neighbor kind of issues because of a shared platform. Then it becomes all completely for yourself. And then you basically have a base unit, but you can also scale up to multiple units. And then basically you have a higher price, but you have dedicated computing. And then it's more upfront cost than the pay-as-you-go model. Similarly with, because durable functions is part of functions, it's either consumption plan, it's premium plan with VNet integration, depending if you have those enterprise requirements, or you can even go completely dedicated with an app service plan. So consumption, again, this is completely based on the executions with some free executions given to you. So the pricing, for instance, this sample could be around $20. If you ramp up using the premium functions, then depending on the instance you choose, the price goes up a bit. Or if you divert to an app service plan because you want a complete dedicated computer with an app service environment similar to an integration service environment, then the price goes further up, but then you have your completely set of hardware available to you. So there's a bit of pricing and hosting. So let's look at some of the use cases with regards to these three types of technologies when it comes to workflow. So one of the things you can do with Power Automate is something which is called robotic process automation. So you can record tasks within systems that are not exposed through APIs or whatsoever, but then through recording the task using type of Selenium technology, you can automate those tasks and play those back. So with regards to that, you have the Power Automate connector for this RPA type of process. So basically what you do, with regards to legacy apps, you launch a recorder, you record some of the steps, and then you build up completely your workflow. This is something you can do. It's one of the newer features you can have with Power Automate. So what I have here is a recorded sample of a friend of mine, Ken Ware, who's currently the principal program manager at Power Automate. So that's why I also included the URL. So you can watch this completely with all the context. So basically it's a Win automation tool that he automates basically by clicking, recording it, and then gets the figures into an Excel sheet. So this is what this small little video basically depicts. So you can watch the full story. It's about 20-25 minutes, how this all works in the background. But this is what you, for instance, can do with Power Automate. When it comes to Logic App, for instance, with ingestion of data, you can automate this through using a scheduled process where you can say, okay, I'm going to, let's say, get the exchange rate US dollar towards any other currency. I ingest the data, I convert the epoch value, which is in the response, to date time. I push it to a queue. I have another Logic App, which then subsequently stores it in the Cosmos DB. So then I have this process completely automated using some of the Azure components combined with a Logic App. So what I would do if I create this type of solution, I would open the designer, I would add triggers and actions, and then I could trigger this process, which I will demonstrate shortly. When it comes to, for instance, a scenario, and this is an enterprise application integration scenario, a little bit hybrid, where an on-premise system like Bistock will connect to a warehouse management system and a payrolling system, push that data to a Logic App, will then interact with Dynamics 365, basically kicks off a recurring process. The recurring process basically returns an ID, which will then subsequently be pushed to a service bus, which triggers another Logic App, will subsequently through an interval, get the status itself. So that's kind of the integration itself. But you also see these logging kind of arrows, which all pushes messages to a queue where there's another logic app, picking up those messages and insert those in a Cosmos DB, providing a complete dashboard to show all the steps from BizTalk, or at least all these systems all the way up here in certain steps to see, hey, how does this process look like, and from an auditing perspective as well, or when, you know, in this process the data flow from A to B fails. So this is where logic app, for instance, also can take a role. And then coming back to the ingestion data before we'll go into the demo, is that I can do the same process of ingesting the data from this open exchange rates by using durable functions. So I have a client that is being kicked off. It will subsequently get the rates, convert to the epoch to a timestamp, and then store it in a database. So let's demo. Go through 2 demos. One regards to logic apps, similar to Power Automate, but and with regards when it comes to the designer. So this is the resource group containing all the artifacts, which was depicted in that little diagram. So I'll just click on the logic app designer. So this is the working environment either in the browser, or you have the similar working environment for the Visual Studio. So there's a recurrence. It will kick off once an hour. It will then subsequently call the open exchange rates, parse that response to give accessibility to all the properties, because one of the properties is an epoch value, the timestamp, which I subsequently give this to a function to change this into datetime. There's no out-of-the-box expression function available inside logic apps to do this. And then I add the property, the datetime, to the response, and then I'll just basically send it to a queue to basically give it to another logic app, which subsequently inserts it into a Cosmos DB. So also this kind of chaining going on here. So one logic app doing one thing and the other, but this is more like single responsibility and get some loosely coupledness between the logic apps. And ultimately, it will push that data. So this is how the data looks into a Cosmos DB. So I can do this with using logic apps, but I also could do this using durable functions. So this is the code. It basically has got this client, which I will call in a second through using Postman. And then subsequently, this is the orchestrator, which will then say, okay, hey, get the USD exchange rate, do the timestamp, and then insert it into Cosmos DB. So this is completely from, you know, creating this type of workflow using durable functions. So I can kick this off, and then I'll go to my runtime, which subsequently will. And there's a little bit of a lag in here, but it will execute, as you can see. And in the meantime, because it exposes those management APIs, I can send, you know, to get the status, and then you'll see the output is basically, hey, I got the exchange rate, hey, I got the epoch to timestamp, etc. So this happens in the background. And if you open the Storage Explorer, then you can also see the tables and the queues involved with regards to the durable task framework. So if you really want to dive into it, you can have a look there as well. Or when you host it up in Azure, in an apps, a function app, then also through the tight storage, you can also see the queues and the tables being created or being available where you can see it. So there's also a way of terminating the process or do some other operations on top of that durable task framework. So this is just shortly what I wanted to express and show you with regards to logic apps on one end and durable function on the other end. So one's completely with a designer, the other one's completely with code. And if you look at, you know, scenarios where durable tasks, or at least where durable functions are being used, this is an example from Microsoft. This is one of the customer stories for Fujifilm. So they ingest a lot of photos. They subsequently do some pre-processing and then in parallel execute a face API to analyze these pictures, do some classifications, etc., and do an exploration before it will store those results. So this is kind of a fan-in, fan-out type of scenario with durable functions, which is possible and which is being depicted here, and which is something you can look up. So that actually the durable functions also is being real used in real life, together with the logic app, which I gave you an example of enterprise application integration, as well as Power Automate, which is used in various forms, including RPA. Okay, so what about monitoring, reporting, and governance, or operational type of perspective? When it comes to the Power Platform, they got this one kind of application or service available, which is the Admin Center, which basically provides everything you kind of need from an operational governance perspective. So it will give you insights into usage and performance, analytics, but you also can create all kinds of dashboarding using the Power BI. So this is from the perspective of Power Automate inside the Microsoft Cloud offering. And with the Admin Center, it doesn't just limit itself to Power Automate, but also gives the ways of doing stuff with regards to virtual agents or when it comes to Power Apps itself. On the other hand, if you look at Azure with logic apps or even functions, then there's multiple tooling or capabilities available. So you're talking about Azure Monitor, Advisor, Cost Management, and so forth. So there's multiple services available which you need to leverage and use when it comes to governance, but also monitoring and such, of alerting, etc. Okay, so I talked about all these free workflow technology, a little bit on how to use cases, monitoring, talked about it, but how do these things, these technologies are all part of the complete Microsoft offering in the cloud or in Azure. What's the relation to each other? So this is what this kind of slide predicts, right? So all these technologies combined. So you have Power Automate on top of logic apps, which sits on top of, or which can leverage, the portal, PowerShell, Visual Studio. It ties into with the connectors and such. So that's one end. And then logic apps can also call an Azure function, or you can expose an Azure function inside of Power Automate. So this is how the relationship is between all these technologies. So, like I said, you can create your function and then expose that function or make it consumable inside Power Automate. It's a pretty straightforward process. So basically, the other thing you can do is you export your flows to Visual Studio and then further extend those within a logic app type of concept. So you further extend those to have them run on Azure itself. So that's the other thing when it comes to Power Automate and logic apps. And then again, also an Azure function can be consumed inside a logic app, which I show with the epoop to timestamp. So I can create a function and then through an Azure logic app connector or logic app connector, you can consume that function. So this is how those technologies can complement each other or provide extensibility. And if you want to look at, for instance, functions and logic apps and stuff working together, then this is also another interesting scenario which Microsoft provided when, when cars go through a toll booth and their picture, at least the picture of their car is being taken because they need the license plate. Those photos are being basically pushed to blobs, which then subsequently, through blob create events that are being pushed through a centrally service which is called event grid and then routed to one or multiple functions. So this could be a function that would use OCR, so optical character recognition for the license plate, and kick off some other functions which would push that license data and verify if the car owner has a subscription or is known within the system, so it could be debited through a credit card or maybe needs to be notified through a letter and required to make that payment. So if you've ever been to Seattle, there's a toll registration booth when you go from Seattle to Bellevue, where this solution is basically in the background. You can do this differently if you use, for instance, I2Edge and push that computer all the way into there and they just push out the license plates by itself. So this is a more cloud platform kind of scenario, but it shows you that, where functions and logic apps and such, are basically working together. Okay, finally, what do analysts kind of say? How do you, if you look at these technologies, are they positions in the market, right? So if you look at, Power Automate, which is part of Power Platform and is looked as low code or no code, it kind of sits within the leaders, right? It gets some competition with Salesforce, OutSystems, and Mendix. So it's pretty on par with some of the competition as well, backed by for the fact that, there's a complete Azure platform behind it, where you see this with Mendix, OutSystems, Salesforce. There's a platform, but it's not as extensive as, Microsoft Cloud or Azure. Same with Forrester, that also kind of, you see the same type of players. So you see Mendix, OutSystems, Microsoft, and Salesforce again. So again, also another analyst who are saying, hey, this technology is really far up there and it's one of the leaders. And when it comes to Logic App, which is part of what's called the Integration Platform as a Service, again, Microsoft slowly from its GA a couple of years ago moved to the leader contract as well, where you also find MuleSoft, which is part of Salesforce as well, and some of the other technologies like SnapLogic, Jitterbit, or Delboomi. So again, it also competes there, but again, Microsoft, backs the fact that it's got a complete ecosystem behind it with the Azure platform. So that's why it stands out in a certain way. And that brings me to kind of the takeaways. So, Automate, Logic Apps, and Azure, they can sit together pretty nicely. They're not really competing technologies, more based upon the target audience. So if you're well versed or kind of inside that Microsoft Cloud we're in, and you're used to the Power Platform tooling and your way around, so you're kind of being labeled in some way as a power user or a citizen developer, because it's kind of completely open, everything is abstracted away, it's easier for you, and you can automate your processes or even your business processes using Power Automate. When it comes to, let's say, more integration type of scenarios, and you want a little bit more control, then Logic App is a better choice for those kind of things and scenarios. And when it completely comes to having full control over your kind of workflow process, then Durable Functions can be a good choice, because there's also support statefulness because of the leveraging in the background of Azure Storage and queues. So basically, the kind of takeaway I want to give you is they're not competing, and based on your use case and scenarios, you can pick one or even multiple of these technologies supporting your business processes within your organization. All of them are kind of mature technologies. So like Power Platform has been out there for 5 years. Power Automate was known before as Microsoft Flow, and they, like last year, changed the name into Power Automate. But it's a technology that's out there and now subsequently is being added with more features and capabilities, for instance, like the robotic process automation, which is another field of technology that's being boosted, and there's a lot of market in there going forward in the coming years. So all are kind of mature leading technologies, and I would say learning these technologies is quite a moderate. Well, if you're really a coding guy, then the Durable Functions can be a good fit for you. But learning these technologies is not too hard from my perspective, I would say. So I would say it's a moderate learning curve. It's another takeaway I want to give you. Being that, if you want to learn these technologies, so this is more like the call for actions, whether you're a citizen developer or just a full developer. When it comes to Automate, Power Automate, there's a community, there's a blog, there's a YouTube channel, there's tons of videos and series, and basically there's a lot of content available. And there's also an Power Automate product roadmap you can access. So I'm sure these slides will come your way and you can use these. But these are kind of the content you can reach when it comes to Power Automate. When it comes to Logic App, there's Logic App feedback, which gives you some insights as well of how this looks. There's a roadmap. There's some integration user group content, some of through the Cloudee Integration Monday channel. There's Logic App tutorials on YouTube, and there's even a Logic App blog as well. And finally, when it comes to Durable Function, again, there's a community, there's a blog, YouTube channel. If it comes to code samples, there's tons you can find on GitHub, and there's also user group content available. So for using technology, it's easy to get your hands on content materials and start learning this. Even Microsoft Learn has some content out there as well when it comes to these technologies. So you don't have to worry about, hey, how do I master these type of technology when it comes to automating your business processes. And with them, I kind of almost talked for an hour, and I like those who are listening live to this recording. Thanks for your attention, and also those who will watch this later on. Thanks for listening to this talk about building workflows on Microsoft Cloud and Azure.
Okay, thank you so much. That was very insightful. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask your questions in the chat window or unmute yourself. That's absolutely fine as well. And if no one else has a question, actually I do have a question. Sorry for the lawnmower in my background. Steef-Jan, in your opinion, when it comes to Power Apps, I would really want to learn, how do you think about deployment of Power Apps and Power Automate and so on and so forth? Because you've mentioned previously in Logic Apps that you already have a markup which is JSON based. That's amazing. You can deploy your application to your customer side. If you're a citizen developer, do you only work for your company, or can you be a citizen developer consulting and providing applications for others?
And it's kind of a tricky question. I had some recent discussion as well, because in my view, the whole Power Platform is very targeted towards organization itself and less on exposing capabilities or functionality or flows or business process to the outside world. So, and also with regards to the DevOps story, it's completely about exporting your stuff and then importing again. It's similar to Logic App. You got this exporty importy kind of thing. Well, with Azure Functions, it's completely seamless integrated, right? From start to finish, it's basically upstream process, you could say. That kind of the answer you're looking for? Or?
Yeah, I reckon when it comes to Power Automate, you probably put it somewhere where you need some sort of a business workflow implementation of sorts within your organization, so that you maybe integrate stuff, I guess, data sources, and put together data for dashboards and so on and so forth.
I think that's a fair point. Also, what you just mentioned, and this is interesting too, it's more the governance aspect too, because you basically democratize the technology to your end users, but then again, do you want your end users touching the data sources itself? So a lot of it comes to providing access to, which is done through the connectors that are shared for the Power Platform as well as for Logic Apps. But then again, also, are you allowed to get that data, and how do you how do you expose that data, especially when it comes to Power Apps, right? Because you kind of visualize the data. Same with Power BI. So there's an interesting discussion or challenge there as well. Data access and data visibility.
Okay, that's quite a lot of details there.
No, but when it comes to Logic App, it's more controlled, because then it's also very internally focused, and then you can expose, when you expose your Logic Apps, you can do this through API management and such, similar to, of course, let's say a doable function. I'm not sure how that would work with Power Automate, but with Logic Apps and functions, you can at least harden the security by using API management.
I hear you. Does anyone have any other questions? Thanks, Dan.
Yep.
Okay, so I guess that's about it for now. No more Q&As for us, I guess. I'm sure
no, it all boils down to having lots of control by code, of course, versus completely abstracted away, and then basically have a browser to your disposal and create your flows there. But that's still the challenge, of course, with security, governance, and that kind of stuff. So yeah.
Awesome. So before we end the recording of the presentation today, I do want to mention everyone that our upcoming session, which is most likely going to happen in September, stay tuned because we'll announce it, is going to be about the top 10 Azure security fails and how to avoid them. Our speaker will be Carl Otts, a good friend of mine, who's the VP of Cloud Security at Swiss Re. You probably have heard of Swiss Re before. It's the leading wholesale provider for reinsurance, insurance, and other insurance-based forms of risk transfer, which is pretty much, as far as I know, the largest insurance company around Europe, at least. They deal with direct and working through brokers. They have a global client base, which consists of insurance companies, mid-large size corporations, and even a public sector client. And Carl, as mentioned previously, will talk about security in Azure in that regard. And with that, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Steef-Jan, for an amazing conversation and talk today. And hope to see you soon in better terms, in person.
Yes, I hope so too. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.